I was
So
going to say, I just had a heart attack. I'm like, oh my God.
I was just looking up at my clock. I'm so used to looking at
Oh.
Pacific time. No worries, Dee. So why don't we go ahead and get started? I know we've got a full agenda for today, so I'll let you take over from here.
Love it. Can you do me a favor? Can you invite Louise if she's got time to make it to this?
Yes.
Thanks so much. All right, everybody see my screen? Good morning, everyone. And I'm sure it's being recorded, so if you miss anything, no worries, we'll catch up. As I just mentioned, our risk management attorney, BRM, did a fantastic presentation on Monday regarding the buyer broker agreements. Actually, let me just go back a slide or so. I've known Bill Jansen for 20 plus years. Bill Jansen is one of California's premier real estate attorneys. I first met him in my very first startup. So he was, great guy then, great guy now, incredibly knowledgeable. I look to him as my guiding light when it comes to resource in regards to things like this. So let's just get started. Some of this will be review on materials that we've covered over the last couple of weeks. I think all of you know this is going to be an ongoing series of educational sessions because things are changing constantly. At this point in time, things are in flux. But today we're going to do a deep dive into the buyer representation agreement. As all of you know, this goes into effect officially mid-July, but for Radius, it will go into effect come May 1st. So I want everyone to get very familiar with it. So when we talk a little bit about the buyer broker agreement and what was the catalyst that facilitated us having a mandatory document now in our quiver of things that we have to do. I've talked quite a bit about the NAR settlement. Even though the settlement's not been approved, California knows that it's going to happen. So we're advising for sure that, you start to get very familiar with some of the suggested, recommended, and future mandatory documents. One of those being the buyer broker agreement. Again, changes will happen mid-July 2024. Everything is subject to a court approval, but in anticipation of that being ratified, we know that it's in the best interest of all parties to settle. Particularly since money is not endless and it's very easy for people to just pull the plug and say, I can't do it, here's bankruptcy, right? And we definitely don't want that to happen. So NAR will pay over $418 million over 4 years. It brings the total settlement amount to $750 million as it sits right now. Quite a hefty sum of money, and that's the other litigants who were involved in the case as well. Anywhere, Remax, Compass, those folks all settled in the tens of millions of dollars. So at this point in time, it brings the settlement amount to a little over $700 million. Not bad for a paycheck, yeah? Settlement includes a new MLS rule prohibiting offer of broker compensation on the MLS. I've talked quite a bit about no compensation on the MLS. It does not mean that you can't advertise compensation elsewhere. It just simply means you cannot advertise compensation on the multiple listing services. That's the critical point. Listing agents can must secure seller's approval prior to any amount being paid to the buyer's agent. So I mentioned this before. This is all about full transparency. I've heard a number of agents say this has nothing to do with antitrust, and it absolutely has everything to do with antitrust. Unfortunately, everything we do or say can be misconstrued or interpreted as an antitrust statement. I will be doing another room on that in regards to some of the language that we need to start omitting in our day-to-day speak with buyer and seller customers. Okay. But in the spirit of full transparency, a seller must approve any amount that's paid to a buyer's agent. They need to be aware of it. All parties, it's good practice. All parties should always be fully transparent, right? I never understood why agents kind of want to do the I'm not going to share my toys with you kind of thing, but it happens. So MLS participants acting for buyers will enter into a written agreement prior to touring a home. What does that mean? That means that before you show any property whatsoever, right? This is different than what most of you may be used to. Most of you are used to meeting someone who may want to facilitate a purchase. In other words, buy a property somewhere. And you say, oh, great, I've got some time today. Let's go look at 1234 Main Street, 1234 Smith Street, and so on and so on. And you'll either meet them there or you pop them in your car. You may have looked on the listing to see what entry looks like. Otherwise, you're just using your super key and going straight in. Well, that will no longer happen. Going forward, you will, in writing, have a buyer broker agreement signed prior to touring any home. And be prepared. A listing agent may ask you, can I see your buyer broker agreement? Okay. I know that some people had concerns in our last week's Q&A regarding privacy and what does the seller care, what I'm getting paid. Again, full transparency. Seller must approve any amount that's being paid, even if it's being paid out by the buyer. It's just, it's just good practice at this point going forward. Compensation has always been negotiable, okay? It's always been negotiable, at least for the length of time that most of you have been in practice. Compensation has always been 100% fully negotiable. There is no standard 5%, 6%, 4%, 3%. It's fully negotiable. Even in the method of how it's being paid, it can be a flat fee. It can be a percentage. But it is 100% negotiable. It's important that you guys continue to remember that. Commission has always been 100% negotiable. So again, sellers or the listing agent more specifically cannot include any form of compensation on the MLS. There is no mention of compensation. As a matter of fact, many of the forms are being reworked. The listing agreement, obviously the buyer broker agreement, things like that, but there is no mention of compensation on the multiple listing service. Now, the seller can have concessions for the buyer on the MLS. So if the seller's going to pay a certain amount of money towards the buyer's closing costs or for repairs or for upkeep or anything like that, the seller can list such concessions on the MLS as long as they are not conditioned or tied to compensating the buyer broker. Now, let me say that again because this has been asked several times. More specifically, the statement or the question was, can the buyer can the seller put a concession on the MLS in the amount of the commission for the buyer? And, again, our risk management attorney said, absolutely not. This is not something that can happen. So if the seller has a concession of 3% of the purchase price, and that just happens to line up with exactly the amount that the buyer is compensating the buyer's agent, the buyer broker, that may be construed as compensation listed on the MLS for the benefit of the buyer broker. And, I'm sure there's going to be a level of oversight that exists. So those things I want you all to be very mindful of, okay? I know it's easy to kind of think about this in a way that says, oh, well, they're not going to really catch me. Who's got that kind of time to provide that level of oversight? Because of the magnitude of this lawsuit, I would advise each and every one of you to be very mindful of this event, okay? I don't know what's going to happen from an enforcement standpoint, but I don't want to be on the other end of that either, okay? Other changes. So offers of compensation, as we just discussed, will no longer be displayed on the MLS in their public feed. So what does this mean for you as real estate practitioners or realtors more specifically? Um, so all realtors should start acting on these rules way before July. We here at Radius are encouraging each and every one of you to start getting comfortable today, not tomorrow, today, so that when the time hits, this is business as usual for you. Again, inside of the boundaries of the brokerage, you will be mandated to have a buyer broker agreement in your file for any buy side transactions that you do. That's, we just believe that it makes sense to be ahead of the game. The audit team is already adjusting the checklists to make sure they include the buyer broker agreement as mandatory. I sense that many other companies will be doing the same, will be following suit. Again, why wait till the last minute? Let's get very comfortable with it now, which is why all of you are here today. So, just kind of reinforcing the same points. There is no offer of compensation on the multiple listing service. In terms of communicating concessions that may indicate that you're paying the buyer broker a certain amount will be prohibited as well. So I want to make that very clear just so that there's no confusion going forward. Listing agents can advertise in all other forms of media, flyers, websites, e-blasts, things like that. They just can't advertise on the multiple listing service. So on their website, they can say things like, seller approved 3% commission to buyer broker agreement, things like that. Or in a percentage, whatever it is. Keep in mind, guys, the minute you establish agency, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, the minute you establish agency, and what do I mean by establishing agency? Anytime conversation with a potential prospect becomes less than casual, you have established agency, which means you have engaged your professional license. So a good example of that would be, hello, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, how are you? They say, I'm great. They said, how's the real estate market, D? I say, the real estate market is great. That's a casual conversation. It's non-specific. It's not engaged my license. In other words, it's not a licensed activity to say, the market's great. They say, I want to know about 1234 Main Street. We're interested in purchasing that property. Now that is officially a licensed activity. Any action I take from that point forward creates agency. Agency means that you have a fiduciary responsibility or fiduciary capacity to that person. That's a relationship of trust. They've technically employed you, irrespective of compensation, to do work for them. Even though it may be research and may not culminate in a closed transaction, you've created agency. So I want each and every one of you to think about your day-to-day practices and think, am I creating agency every time I open my mouth? Many of us are, because we don't always realize when that threshold changes. We think we're still just having casual conversation because they haven't gone out and seen anything yet. But if you look at it in a manner that they can take the information that you shared and go out and attempt to make a purchase, successful or unsuccessful, and could turn around and sue you as a result of the professional information you provided to them. That's right, folks. Your license has value. It holds weight. It's no different than a doctor, a nurse, a lawyer, anyone else who's in a licensed profession that can injure someone. That's the level of weight your license carries, which is why sometimes the fines and restrictions and the sanctions that come down are quite severe, because we can severely injure someone. Okay. Signed buyer representation agreements will be required prior to showing a home to a buyer. How do we communicate with our customers? New steps in realtor communications with clients and their relationships will be implemented. Many of you aren't used to having detailed conversation with your buyers in advance. They kind of basically give you a laundry list of the things they may want, and then you start to try and match the things on their laundry list with what's available in inventory. Some of these actions are going to be forcing you guys to have a more meaningful conversation with your buy side clients. We will be doing what's called a patterned interview course, which gives you a process or a flow of how to actually interview a buy side client to where you're getting the maximum amount of information and able to provide instruction so that your level of expectation and your buyer's level of expectation are equally matched. Okay. Remember that NAR Code of Ethics requires that realtors, prior to entering a representation agreement, have an affirmative obligation to make reasonable efforts to determine whether the prospect is subject to a valid exclusive arrangement with another real estate professional. Simply put, what does that mean? Part of effective communication going forward with your buy-side client will be, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, are you working with another practitioner? Are you subject to the boundaries of that contract with them? When will it expire? Do you mind if I see that particular agreement? It's going to be even more germane that all of you are maintaining that level of practice. In other words, are you working with someone? May I see that agreement so that, first of all, you can see the terms of that agreement, not necessarily financially, but more specifically, when does it terminate? Is it specific to area only? And I'll talk a little bit about that. How can you insinuate yourself or not insinuate yourself? But it's important that you know if a person who approaches you is working with someone in advance of you doing any work. Remember, be judicious in the level of language that you use. If someone asks you specifics, you need to kind of hold your tongue until you can establish a relationship formally. It's not like you go to your doctor and you go, you know what, doc, I've been having this pain in my side. What do you think it is? The minute the doctor starts talking, it could be your appendix, it could be your liver, it could be your spleen. The minute they start providing professional advice, they've already created a relationship with you. Okay. Same with a realtor. Doctors never do that. Doctors never, you ask them what's wrong, they say, you know what, let's make an appointment so I can evaluate. They create a business relationship so that they're indemnified and protected should they do anything further. Same thing should happen with you as a licensed real estate professional. Okay. And so again, every time you meet with a buy-side client, you should be asking the following questions. Have you previously worked with another agent looking for a property? If so, did you sign an agreement with that agent? Can I see a copy of that signed agreement? Okay. It's your job. I want to stress that it's your job to know whether or not they're working with someone else, because you could be found guilty of an ethics violation, right? Our section 15, article 9 in the business and professional code, your job is to make sure that they are not working with someone else. Okay. Always ask for a copy of the BRBC, the buyer broker buyer representation agreement. Review it to confirm whether it's expired. If they're looking for another type of property other than what they may have signed with another practitioner, things like that. Again, you want to know the terms because that's going to help keep you safe. And if you're not sure, please reach out to me through support@radiusagent.com. I will be happy to look at your agreement in real time to make sure that you're safe. Again, make sure you're utilizing the support@radiusagent.com email. Don't email me directly. Don't email Kathy directly, primarily because it might get lost in the shuffle. But you will always get an immediate response at support@radiusagent.com. Okay. If the buyer is unhappy with a prior agent, we see that all the time. You know what? My agent's not doing what I want them to do. Would you mind working with me? And some of us have been in a drought. We haven't worked for a minute, right? So we're always eager and anxious to take on new business. Again, be very judicious in how you proceed with acquiring new business. If somebody wants to cancel a buyer broker agreement, send them to a QCREA, and let me look that up because I don't know what that means right off the top of my head. Guys, I'm going to have to get back to you on that. I am not sure what that means right off the top of my head. Okay. That's a bill acronym. So it's qualified something. But it's not you. Okay. So the truth of it is you don't want to contact the other broker. You never want to contact the other broker and go, hey, are you working with Mark Jones? Right? Because A, that's an ethics violation. And B, you could be opening up the buyer to potential liability in regards to being responsible for 2 levels of commission. Okay. And that's not anything that you want to establish for the buyer. Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. QCREA stands for Qualified California Real Estate Attorney.
Thank you so much.
You got it, brother.
I'm thinking to myself, man, I knew that was a bill acronym and I knew it was qualified for something, but I couldn't think of it. So essentially, they're saying do not provide legal counsel. It's not your job. You want to refer them to a qualified California real estate attorney. Thank you for that, Scott. Always got my back. I appreciate you. This can lead to liability. Again, you interfering with another broker's customer. So you want to make sure that your buyer is acting above board. Again, they could be potentially liable for 2 levels of commission. To pay 2 practitioners. I'm sorry. So always be asking questions, guys. Always, always, always. So again, what do we do prior to entering into a buyer broker agreement? Each buyer, as you know, must trust that you're going to be the person that can facilitate the deal in the manner in which they're hoping to make it happen. That's, again, I mentioned a pattern interview. That all happens inside the framework of a patterned interview. Again, many of us are so used to someone coming forward and saying, I want to go see 1234 Main Street. Are you the person? Now we think we've got a customer. Reality is we don't. We don't know anything. Even though they may be wanting to look at a specific property, it doesn't mean that that's the property that they want. We've all been through multiple offer situations. We've all been through a frenzied market. So it could be the buyer just responding to FOMO, the fear of missing out. They want to buy something and this may be their opportunity. It fits within their price parameters, but it may not be the ideal house. There may be some limitations or deficits. And that's what a patterned interview will flesh out. If you've not done a patterned interview before, I strongly encourage you to attend my room on how to do a pattern interview so that you're getting and eliciting the correct information all at one time. And that includes the buyer's wants and needs, right? There's a difference between wants or needs. A lot of times we set up the scenario, if you could have anything that you wanted, what would that look like? And you get the buyer to dream and you start to build out all these things, right? But everybody knows how a funnel works. That information goes into basically a funnel so that you can filter out all the things that are not necessarily mandatory, but things that are purposeful. And then you actually now have a product from which you can work. So, and it also gives you an opportunity to showcase your skills and talents. That's part of your value proposition. It gives you that opportunity to show that you're knowledgeable, that you are the person that can execute on what the buyer's asking you for. Okay. So take the time and have that discussion. Slow down. There's not a rush. There won't be as much FOMO, in my opinion, because the buyers are now equally responsible to you, particularly if they may have to write a paycheck. If they may have to, fork over some money, they're going to have higher demands of you now. because I'm paying you. It's no longer exclusively coming from the list side. Me as the buyer, I'm going to have to put some real hard cash into acquiring your services. Okay. Always, 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 always. You'll hear Kathy and I say this 1,000 times a day, no less than. Um, find ways to articulate your value proposition. In order for you to do that, it's important that you understand the value that you bring to the table. In a room we did yesterday, I believe, we talked a lot about your value proposition. I would challenge each and every one of you to understand what your worth is per hour. We kind of talked about minimum wage in California now is $20 for a McDonald's worker, or somebody in the fast food industry. $20 an hour. That's $41,600 a year. It may not sound like a lot of money, but that's a lot of money for someone, doing an entry-level job. That's quite a bit of money. So where do you sit in the scale between, say, the lowest paid job, which is $20 an hour, and the highest paid job? Where do you sit in that? I would suspect most of you sit probably midland in that, between the lowest and the highest. If the highest was, say, $500,000 a year and the lowest is $40,000 a year, where do you fall in that bucket? You're somewhere between $40,000 a year and $500,000 a year. Okay. But understanding your value proposition is everything. It always has been. It has nothing to do with this settlement. The agents that you see, that you look over the fence, that are always doing great business, are agents that understand what they bring to the table and how they can facilitate a business and then garner new additional business by way of referrals for doing such great business to someone else. Okay. Understand your value proposition. Can't stress that enough. Again, the buyer wants and needs, that's all going to fall in the purview of the patterned interview. If you've never heard of a patterned interview, never done a patterned interview, strongly, strongly suggest you come to my pattern interview class. It will be on the calendar shortly. Okay. Again, buyer wants and needs. What are they looking for from an agent? This all falls under the value, under the pattern interview. Okay. Most buyers are not very sophisticated when it comes to real estate, unless they're investors, unless they're flippers, things like that, people who've studied real estate for a financial income purpose versus someone buying it for their owner-occupied needs. So again, when we talk about your value proposition, they're going to want to see the difference. And guys, I want to say it like this, a little bit more holistically. It gives you an opportunity to get additional education in the career that you chose. We all know that real estate is a relatively low barrier of entry career. You take some courses, 3 courses to be specific. You pass the state exam, which is a multiple choice exam, difficult but doable for sure. Then you get a license. Beyond that license, you're not required to do anything else from an educational standpoint other than your continuing education every 4 years in the state of California. That's really not a lot of education, guys, for a very complex industry. I think all of you, the minute you touched the contract, you were like, what the heck is this? And what do I do with it? The buyer asked me this question, what do I do with it? Thankfully, the internet is in place these days, and now we have AI that can help to guide, navigate some of those informational tasks that you're faced with. But even still, that's not enough. The daily flow of being a practitioner is far more involved than just writing a contract or just showing a house. It is really you becoming that trusted advisor to where each and every time you're dealing with a buy side or a sell side client, that you're giving them the right information with detailed knowledge enough for them to make an informed decision. That's your job at the end of the day. So start to break down some of the activities that you do on a daily basis so that you can kind of show the buyer your process. Even when we talk about compensation in the real estate space, it may be you decide to shift to a per hour compensation model, in which case you're really going to have to segment what you do on a daily basis, the value that you provide in order to justify what that fee or that level of compensation may look like. Okay. Again, these are discussions for another room, but these are things that you should be thinking about on a daily basis right now. With inexperienced buyers, it might be a good idea. We've always done this, is to provide them with documents in advance of them signing. That eliminates a lot of the questions, right? So, provide them with an RPA, a residential purchase agreement. Provide them with what an addendum looks like. Give them things to read. Give the buyer homework. Old school cool is get a yellow highlighter or create a document, use a yellow highlighter if you're going to send it to them electronically, but give them some homework. Give them an opportunity to highlight a document so that you can explain the things that they don't understand. Legalese is very confusing, and particularly because we don't write it. We're not attorneys. Attorneys created every contract we're using. We're just merely filling in the blanks. But do you understand the things that you're filling in each and every time you create a contract? Do you know what those things say and how they impact you and how they impact your buyer or your seller? So it gives you an opportunity to familiarize yourself more effectively with the contracts that you use in order to facilitate your work life every day. And it gives information to your buyer on what those things say and the impact that they may have. Okay. Excuse me. Again, making sure that you're explaining to your buyer step by step the things that are going to happen. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, great. Now that we've identified the type of property you're looking for, here's how I work. These are the things that you can expect from me. X, Y, Z, and Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, because we're working together in cooperation to make sure we can facilitate a successful purchase for you, these are the things that I'm going to need for you to do. Are we in agreement, right? You can create that accountability contract with your buyer. That way, that things will flow smoothly. But as many things that you can do in advance of actually getting into the contract is going to be a benefit to both you and to your customer. So prepare the buyer representation that again is exclusive for you. So again, if you just incorporate the buyer broker agreement into your process, like you've always done it, like I've done this for a million years, even though it's your first time, it's going to go much more smoothly. If you really focus on the document so heavily, like many of you do when you're talking about commission, even with a seller, it's going to be problematic because you may not have the tools available to strongly negotiate as to why you're asking for whatever it is you may be asking for. So if you treat it as though, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we've gone through the patterned interview. I've discovered your wants and needs. I know exactly what you're looking for. This is what I'm expecting from you. This is what you can expect from me. We're going to work together. As part of that, we each mutually agree per this document that this is the behavior that we both agree with. Okay. That's how you're going to kind of fold in the buyer broker agreement. If you're going to go, well, as you know, NAR changed and you're going to have to pay me, you're going to have a lot of scared buyers, or you're going to have a lot of buyers who have questions as to, all right, sure, I understand that I may have to pay someone, but why you? Right now, it's going to go back and attack your value proposition if you really focus on the money, right? And many agents are definitely uncomfortable saying why it is that they should get a certain amount of money, whether it's the buy side or the sell side or whatever. They're very uncomfortable with the discussion of money as a whole. So the more opportunities that you have to remove those types of objections, those are the things that we want to focus on. So, and again, if you build this into an entire system versus just a standalone event of, gosh, I'm going to have to talk to this person about paying me. That's going to be hard. Then it's going to be hard. Absolutely. Because you've already created a scenario in your mind to where this is a difficult event and you don't have the tools to successfully get through it. Okay. Sorry, guys. I'm so stuffed up. It's crazy. It's a good thing because it means it's spring, right? So, Bill outlined an example of kind of what the buyer broker program could look like from a language perspective, right? And essentially, he's just looking at the buyer broker agreement, and he's kind of summarized it in his way. So, my responsibility when you sign a buyer representation agreement with me is I will do the following. So he's gone as far as literally outlining each responsibility that the buyer is going to be expecting from you, and vice versa. Again, guys, it's a two-way street. Accountability is always mutual. It's never one-sided. But essentially, you could potentially create a document like a cover page almost that helps to outline exactly what the buyer's signing to and what everybody agrees to, in addition to the actual buyer representation document that speaks to compensation. So it's a multi-part system. I think I've shared with all of you, there's more than just one document in this rotation. It's several documents, but by creating a document that spells out the responsibilities of each, and I will create a draft of this for everyone's use, but kind of spelling out, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, this is what you can expect from me. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, this is what I expect of you. Here's your signature. Here's my signature. Let's go look at some houses, right? Again, it's a multi-document stage, but by literally letting them know what they can expect and signing to it, everybody has an agreement that they can work towards. Okay. Excuse me. You're advising your buyer that you only work with buyers who agree to work exclusively with you. That's not a bad thing at all, right, guys? That's not a bad thing. I mean, we've all had buyers who work with a ton of people. And again, I want to be clear with that statement, which means if a buyer wants to look in San Diego and your market is San Francisco, it's not advisable, even though your license is good all over the state, for you to take that 500-mile trek back and forth to San Diego. It's not the most efficient use of your time. It may be that you might refer the buyer to a practitioner in San Diego and draw a partial fee should the buyer successfully close a property with another agent that you referred. But it's not advisable that you kind of pop in the car or pop on a plane every weekend to go help your buyer client buy a house in San Diego, unless it's like a $10 million house or something, definitely worth the time and energy. If the buyer agrees to work with me for a certain amount of days, I will provide them with all of the services on the buyer representation program. Again, this is a way for you to define and articulate your value. These are all the things I'm bringing to the table. And if you work exclusively with me, all these things are available to you. You've got all of my services and my 100% commitment that I'm going to get you into a property that may be your forever home. Okay. So a place to where you can grow your family and experience the enjoyments of life and all the above as a landowner and all that good stuff. And again, I will create an outline or a template for you guys to use. You can adjust and modify that any way you choose, but at least it'll give you a framework on how to begin putting your buyer broker program package together. Okay. Advise your buyer that at the end of whatever term that you discuss with them, they can either renew with you or they can choose to cancel. Very similar to a listing agreement, right? Sometimes in a listing agreement, we've done everything we can. We took a 3, 6, 9-month listing. Unfortunately, the market didn't support either our price or the condition of the property itself was not what the public may be looking for, because that's evidenced by no offers or low offers, things like that. It may be time to reevaluate the relationship and or the product itself, which is the house, in a listing agreement, right? And then we say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I want to continue to work with you. I think if we made subtle adjustments, we could market your home differently and get a better result. That may be an opportunity of renewal. The same would happen in a buyer representation agreement program, in the fact that I agreed to work with this buyer for a period of 90 days. They agreed to do certain things. One of those is pre-approving with a lender, all those good things. We went out and looked. Inventory was very reduced. The type of property that the buyer was looking for was not readily available. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we're coming into a season to where there may be more inventory. I would love the opportunity to continue to work with you. Does that make sense? Would you be open to that? Now that's an opportunity at renewal. Or Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, obviously our relationship's been frictional and we haven't worked well together. I might not be the right practitioner for you. Let's go ahead and release ourselves from the contract, right? But renewals can happen. But just like anything, and this was a question that we had when we did the big Q&A a couple of weeks ago, how will they know? And that's because each contract or each agreement is term-based. It's time-based. I'm going to work with you from April 2nd through July 31st, right? It's got a specific beginning and end date. That means that you and the buyer are beholden to one another for that period of time. And it's subject to any agreement, which is it can be canceled or it can be renewed at its termination time frame. Okay. So your buyer representation helps you to keep your word. Again, it's an accountability process. It's an accountability feature. It's a way of you articulating trust and value that's meaningful to your customer base. So keep your word. There's what's called constructive fraud. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that term, but what constructive fraud is basically, and it happens very innocently. I'll use an example in a listing. You agree at the onset of the listing agreement to hold an open house every weekend until the property goes into contract, right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, the Super Bowl was on, or the NBA playoffs was on, or it was your daughter or your son's wedding, or you had to go out of town for whatever reason, and you didn't hold that open house. You've now effectively committed what's called constructive fraud. You didn't mean to do it, but you breached a component of your agreement by not holding an open house every weekend, no matter what the reason was. That's constructive fraud. That also happens when we're working with buyers. We promise to do a certain thing and we think, it's not really going to make a difference if I do or don't do this thing. If you promised it, you got to fulfill it. Okay. That's where effective communication comes into this. If you're constantly communicating, constantly keep your buyer up to speed and knowledgeable as to the things that go on, you're going to avoid this every day, right? Even if it's bad news, we still have to deliver it, or perceived bad news. We still have to deliver it. But the lack of communication overall is what's destructive. When we choose not to disclose, when we choose not to communicate, that's when we get into problems. And that's when we start to get into unhappy customers, because it's like, geez, I'm on pins and needles and you couldn't even tell me that such and such event just happened. Okay. Keep your word. So the agreement itself, the highlight of the day. Can everybody see that okay? Do I need to make that a little bigger? Because I don't know how in this particular application.
I would make it just a little bit bigger. There's like maybe a zoom button also for the individual.
No, so what this is actually a PDF that I'm drawing from. So it's not the particular. So let me see what I can do.
Oh, no worries. For anyone that needs to make it a little bit larger, there's like a zoom in button in the bottom right corner of your screen. So that may just be a little bit helpful if you're on your computer.
Yeah, unfortunately, guys, I don't have a way to do that, and that's my apologies. But let me see if I can kind of get through this in some shape or fashion. So as you can see in paragraphs 1 and 2, paragraph 1 defines who's working for who. I'm representing, my name is Joe Smith. I'm the buyer, and I'm being represented by D. Wilmore, who's my broker. We're into an exclusive agreement. And then paragraph 2 talks about the representation and what that looks like. And this is very small. I I really want to come back to this. This is a proposed draft of the new document. This is not actually live yet. I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I will send out the PDF after this for everyone to look at, specifically of these slides, so that you can all get a very detailed view of what's being proposed, or what will more than likely be on the new buyer broker agreement or the new revision. Okay, it's not 100% yet, but this is a pretty good representation of what you can anticipate. Again, I just don't have a way of making this larger for you, just due to the nature of this document. Okay, so let's bypass this agreement because I'm going to be sending this out to Ela. Actually, Ela will be sending this out to all of you directly after this. Okay. And then there's the seller payment to the buyer broker. In other words, this is the seller having the ability to offer compensation to the buyer broker. Full transparency is necessary for all these things. This form will be the SPBB, the seller payment to buyer broker. So, many of you have functioned from the knowledge that seller won't be able to pay the buyer broker, and that's just not true. A good listing agent will obviously be able to articulate why it might be important to provide compensation to a buyer broker. Part of that is exposure. There's a number of different reasons, but the seller is still has the ability to offer compensation to the buyer. And again, that's the purpose of the seller payment to the buyer broker, the buyer's broker form, the SPBB. And again, all of these documents, I will be sharing this PDF post this session today with Ela, and Ela will share with you. Okay, the buyer's compensation agreement, which spells out literally what the buyer is going to be compensating you to, and talks about kind of the arrangements between you and that buyer on how you choose to be compensated. Again, these are all documents that are still in draft, but we will do a part 2 to this. Again, I will be sharing these documents. You will have an opportunity to review this, and then we'll do a part 2 to answer any questions that you may have in regards to some of the proposed language of these documents. The buyer transaction advisory, again, very similar to what most of you are already familiar with, but it's advising the buyer to all the terms and features, the development of agency, how the buyer representation agreement allows for dual agency, right? Dual agency still exists. So if you were the listing agent and a buyer came to you, you would be having the buyer sign all of these documents, inclusive of the fact of I may be representing more than one buyer seller in this transaction, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. So you're just merely advising the buyer of these facts and having them sign off on it. The anticipated buyer compensation disclosure, which kind of is a schedule that allows you to see what the money may look like. Again, since commissions are 100% negotiable, there are several different ways that the price can be expressed. It can be expressed as a flat fee. It can be expressed as a percentage. It could be a graduated. In other words, if certain milestone happens and these things happen, it's filtered by the address of the property that you showed. There could be multiple configurations with this document. But again, I showed you 1234 Main Street. I told you 1234 Jones Street. This is a way of you also keeping track of the fact of you are the procuring cause for these properties, because you and the buyer have agreed. I showed you these properties. If the buyer decides to go around you and work with someone else, this is your evidence. This is your ABCD evidence, right? This shows that I did this work. These are the things we agreed to. I expected compensation for these if a transaction was successfully implemented. This is your evidence that you did, in fact, work with that buyer and you were in fact the procuring cause in order to facilitate that sale. Okay. The anticipated buyer compensation disclosure. Where are we on time? Okay. And then some additional forms that will be introduced in June. So the previous forms we looked at are forms that are in rotation, but are going to be adjusted with some additional language. Keep in mind, those forms that we just went over, while they existed prior to January 1 and were implemented January 1, 2024, they're already outdated because of the settlement, right? So they've only really been in play for about 3-ish months. But because of the terms of the settlement, those forms have to be revised. In addition to those forms, new forms will be introduced in June 2024. And one of those is the buyer compensation advisory. It's similar to the buyer transaction advisory, but it focuses, primarily on compensation and how compensation would be paid. Guys, I want you to know these are ongoing rooms, ongoing sessions, because this data adjusts daily in real time, and we want to make sure that you have the most current, the most relevant, so that you're always doing best practices. Okay. Additionally, there will be a notice of broker involved properties. This form is critical for a buyer to be compensated if the agent has a non-exclusive buyer broker representation agreement with the buyer. So there are 3 buyer broker agreements. One addresses compensation, but one's non-exclusive. In other words, that means I'm working with the buyer, but I'm not expecting the buyer to pay me because I'm assuming or anticipating that I'll be compensated from the list side. So the notice of broker involved properties, that's exactly what that form is for. Again, these are forms that will come out in June. So if you thought you were close to your clients, now get closer, right? Again, communication is everything. The more that we can give that high level, that concierge level of service to our buyers so that they feel like, we never made them work and they felt like you were of service and provided them value, the more you'll see that the ROI come back in multiples, right? When you do a good job for somebody, it's infectious and they want to tell everybody what a great job you did. I hope this session was informative. CAR has a buyer representation quick guide. So if you log into smartzonecar.org NAR litigation, that will get you to this. So just type in CAR Smart Zone and it'll take you to a quick guide. Okay. All right, we have a few minutes. Let's open it up for questions. I know I went through that rather quickly, but let's open it up for questions. Questions, guys. Questions, comments. Everybody good to go?
You can also utilize the chat too if anybody wants to just not unmute at this time. That's also an option as well.
Seems like,
hey,
hey.
I just want to say thanks for putting this on, and looking forward to continuing this conversation as it grows forward.
Absolutely.
Curious if we can get those slides today. It just so happens I've got a team meeting this evening, so
they will be today. They will be in the
beautiful.
next hour if Ela can get them out in that time frame. So
Beautiful.
I'll parse them out separately. That way you guys can all get eyeballs on those slides, and then highlight your questions. If you've got questions around it, definitely you can shoot questions out, or you can wait till our next session. Either one, but either way, you'll have an opportunity to have those questions answered. Other questions, guys? Comments, concerns?
I think we're all good to go.
All
Thanks
right,
everyone so
everybody.
much for joining us today.
All right, take care, everybody.
Take care. And thank you, Dee, for